the banks of the Parramatta River lies a place with two faces. By day its sandstone walls and rolling lawns seem peaceful, almost beautiful, but these walls were not built for peace. They were built for confinement. They were built for control. This is Gladesville Hospital, once known as the Tarban Creek Lunatic Asylum, and for more than 160 years it stood as both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where science battled superstition, and where reform clashed with cruelty, and where countless forgotten lives were locked away from the world. Today we're stepping inside its story. From its convict beginnings to its slow decline, we'll trace how Gladesville reflected the best and the worst of a young colony trying to understand the human mind. But to understand why this asylum was built, we need to go back to the very start of European settlement in New South Wales. And when the first fleet arrived in 1788, it carried not just convicts, but trauma. Imagine the journey, 6 months below deck, chained, sick, battered by storms. Most of these unwilling passengers had never seen the ship before, let alone survive one. They endured seasickness, starvation, filth, and violence. By the time they staggered onto Australian soil, many were already broken in body and in mind. And the shock didn't end there. Everything in this new land was upside down. The sun crossed the sky in the opposite direction. The seasons were reversed. Strange birds screeched in the trees. Strange animals hopped across the bush. The stars above bore no resemblance to home. The convicts feared the Aboriginal people. The officials feared the French invasion. And almost everyone feared the loneliness. They were cut off from friends, family, and the comforts of civilization, cast to the very ends of the earth. Morale was low, hope was rare, and those who struggled the most, those who fell into madness, had nowhere to go. For years these men and women were hidden in jails and poorhouses, in makeshift cells, but as the colony grew, the need for a separate place, an institution for the insane, became impossible to ignore. In the 1830s, Governor Bourke ordered plans for a new asylum. The man chosen to design it was Mortimer Lewis, the newly appointed colonial architect. His design allowed for 60 inmates, including 5 special cells for the most violent and noisome. Even in its plans, the asylum showed the class divides of the era. A handful of patients labelled superior class would be housed upstairs in the superintendent's own house. Everyone else, cells. Convict labour built the institution. It was cheap but far from efficient. But convict labour was what the colony had. And so on an elevated site at Tarban Creek, the sandstone walls began to rise. In November 1838, the asylum opened its doors. The cost £13,500. The first 60 cells were soon filled with 80 patients, the beginning of a long and notorious history of overcrowding. By the end of its very first year, 100 people were locked inside. The Tarban Creek Asylum was open with high hopes, but very quickly it became clear this was no place of healing, it was a prison. The first appointees were Dr. McLean as medical officer and Joseph Digby as keeper, and his wife Susanna as matron. The Digbys lived on site, but theirs was an impossible task. The asylum was overcrowded from the very beginning, and with little funding, Joseph Digby was forced to use the worst type of convicts as warders, men brutalised by the system, some even twice convicted from Norfolk Island. Overcrowding was constant. In the women's wing, Digby had just 30 cells for dozens of female patients. It was, as he admitted, undesirable but necessary to cram 2 women into each small, airless cell. And yet, as harsh as he was, Digby also showed glimpses of something different. He allowed the quieter patients down to the riverbanks to fish. He would take small groups out rowing on the Parramatta, even letting some row the boat into Sydney, where they were permitted to wander the streets before returning. The so-called medicines of the day were little more than poisons. Patients were dosed with opium, Epsom salts, and purgatives. or bled until they collapsed. The asylum was meant to heal. In truth, it broke far more people than it cured. Even the basics of survival were a struggle at Tarban Creek. The site was chosen for its good water, but within years the asylum was parched. By 1846, the institution was consuming 700 gallons a day, and the water carts had to haul supplies over a rough, muddy road. In 1850, the situation became so desperate that water had to be shipped from Sydney by boat. Finally, a dam was thrown across Tarban Creek in 1857, but it was poorly built. Within just 3 years, heavy rain washed half of it away. Soil and stones from the river above poured into the reservoir. Even when rebuilt, the water remained polluted and unreliable. Not until 1892, more than half a century later, was the asylum finally connected to the Nepean water supply. Until then, both patients and staff lived with constant shortages, dirty water, and ever-present threat of fire with no means to fight it. It's just amazing, some of these buildings. Absolutely amazing. So doing some repairs on it. It's good to see. Life inside Tarban Creek was brutal, not just for the patients, but for the staff as well. The working day was 12 hours long. Cooks, nurses, keepers, and laundry workers were often convicts themselves. Nursing was primitive, and for many who took the job saw patients as little more than animals to be bullied, beaten, or forced into submission. Dark cells were used to punish the violent. Women were locked in isolation. Men were chained to walls. But life was not entirely without relief. Patients who were often made to work, and this in its own way became an early farm of therapy. They cleared bushland, cut timber, built drains, grew vegetables, milked cows, and even rowed boats. They worked for food and tobacco, small comforts in an otherwise miserable existence. Recreations also existed, though crude by today's standards: reading, chess, skittles, backgammon, and even two-up. But make no mistake, Tarban Creek was not a place of laughter. It was a place where madness and misery were locked away from the polite society, where the line between patient and prisoner was razor thin. By the mid-1800s, Tarban Creek's reputation was in tatters. Dr. Francis Campbell, who took over in the late 1840s, faced growing criticism from newspapers, magistrates, and even visiting politicians. Overcrowding was worse than ever. Patients slept 2 or 3 to a cell, the gutters overflowed, the latrines stank, and disease spread freely. In 1860, when Henry Parkes, who would later become Premier, toured the asylum, he described conditions as appalling. He wrote of patients crawling with vermin, of the stench that turned the stomach, of suffering beyond words. The colonial architect James Barnett went further. He admitted he was so shaken by what he saw at Tarban Creek that he could not sleep for 3 nights afterwards. Campbell himself, however, painted a different picture. In 1863, he claimed the only thing missing to make the asylum the equal of any in England was a small farm and amusement ground. Patients did work. They grew vegetables, milked cows, tended poultry, cooked meals, and maintained the grounds. They even enjoyed reading, cards, drafts, chess, and skittles. But behind this thin veneer of activity, horror stories persisted. By the 1860s, the asylum had become notorious From every glimpse of reform, there had been scandals of cruelty, neglect, and corruption. It was clear something had to change. In 1867, Tarban Creek reached a turning point. Dr. Frederick Norton Manning, a young Royal Navy surgeon, was persuaded by Henry Parkes to take over as medical superintendent. Before accepting, Manning toured the asylums across Europe, studying the newest methods of treatment. What he found shocked him, but also inspired him. When he returned to New South Wales in 1868, Manning brought with him a new philosophy. Patients were not prisoners, they were people, and their treatment should aim not just to confine, but to cure. The first thing he did was change the name. Tarban Creek Lunatic Asylum became Gladesville Hospital. Manning trained staff in proper care. He would welcome public visits, hoping that transparency would dispel the asylum's dark reputation. He fought to alleviate overcrowding and improve facilities. He introduced cottages to replace grim cell blocks, even designed for 16 patients and one attendant. These cottages had verandas, gardens, and open space. They gave patients the feeling of home, not prison. Manning even encouraged donations of animals, ducks, deer, swans, and even a koala. He believed the presence of animals in gardens could soothe troubled minds in ways medicines could not. This is not to say the asylum suddenly became a paradise. Patients were still locked away, still stigmatized, still subjected to crude treatments. But under Norton Manning, Gladesville began to change. It became a place of possibility where compassion and reform started to break through the cracks of confinement. By the late 1800s, Gladesville was no longer just a grim place of confinement. Under Norton Manning and his successors, it had transformed into a community of its own, one powered by the labour of its patients. Workshops sprang up: blacksmithing, bookbinding, bootmaking, tailoring, plumbing, painting, upholstery, and carpentry. The philosophy was simple: every patient who could be induced to work should work. What had once forced drudgery now became framed as therapy, work that gave routine, dignity, and in some cases a sense of pride. But Gladesville was more than labour. It became a place of recreation: reading rooms, billiards, cards, chess, and skittles. And part of the daily life, sports grounds were carved out of the hospital's sweeping lawns. And in time, these grounds would host one of the greatest cricketers the world had ever known. In the 1930s, as the Great Depression gripped Australia, cricket gave people hope, and even Gladesville Hospital was not untouched by that magic. On Wednesday in February 1931, the leader newspaper reported on a match played right here on the hospital ground. Don Bradman, the Don himself, stepped up to bat. He scored 89 runs, and then, as if that wasn't enough, took 5 wickets. By 1952, patients themselves were building a new road past a recreation ground, felling old trees to make way. Though slow, the work symbolised the hospital's growing focus on integration, encouraging patients to contribute to the very spaces they enjoyed. And while recreation and therapy thrived, darker truths remained. Overcrowding, underfunding, and neglect still haunted the institution. But in these moments on the cricket pitch, in the annual fair, or during a summer picnic by the river, Gladesville felt more like a town than a prison. A hidden world within Sydney where madness, sport, and community existed side by side. As the 20th century began, Gladesville's population continued to climb. What was designed for dozens now held hundreds and soon thousands. Through the depression of the 1930s, staff worked for meagre pay. Resources dwindled, and families abandoned relatives they could no longer afford to take care for, sending them through the asylum gates. Then came World War II. For 6 years, supplies were stretched thin. Young men who might have become warders or nurses instead marched off to fight. Those left behind struggled to care for the patient population that only grew larger. By the 1950s, the numbers were staggering. In 1955, a government report revealed that Gladesville Hospital housed 1,775 inmates. The conditions were described as overcrowded, underfunded, and unsafe. Nursing and professional staff were in critical shortage. The report concluded bluntly it would take £1 million to bring the hospital up to standard. But money never came easily. For decades, Gladesville limped on, too big to close, too underfunded to thrive. Despite its problems, by the mid-20th century also brought changes. In 1963, the enclosing walls and fences that had once made Gladesville look like a fortress were finally removed. The philosophy was shifting. No longer should patients be shut off from the world. Instead, the new focus was on reducing dependence, encouraging normal activities, and opening the institution to the community. Patients were encouraged to work not as forced labourers but as volunteers, with small wages paid for gardening, cleaning and helping in the kitchens. They joined community sports. They went on outings in the Royal Easter Show. Small ferries would even dock at the hospital's wharf to take groups of patients on excursions along the Parramatta. The gates, once a symbol of imprisonment, were left open all but one day a year. When they were closed briefly to maintain legal ownership, Gladesville was becoming less of a prison, more of a community hub. By the 1980s, psychiatric care worldwide was changing. New medicines promised relief from conditions that once meant lifelong confinement, and public attitudes towards mental illness were slowly shifting. In 1983, the Richmond Report called for the deinstitutionalisation of psychiatric care in New South Wales. Patients would no longer be locked away for life. Instead, they would live in the community, supported by outside services. At Gladesville, the change was profound. By the 1990s, wards stood empty, long-term patients were moved out, often into hostels or community housing. Staff numbers dwindled. The hospital that had once dominated the suburb was fading. In 1995, the state government made a decision that still sparks debate today. Much of Gladesville's northern campus, prime land overlooking Tarban Creek, was sold off for housing. The sale was a boon for the Treasury, but a blow to heritage. Generations of history were bulldozed, sold, and paved over. The hospital itself struggled for a few years. In 1998, Gladesville was amalgamated with Macquarie Hospital. By then, only 21 long-term patients remained on site, living out their final days where they were spent most of their lives. A chapter in Sydney's history, one that stretched back to convicts in chains, was closing. For all its darkness, Gladesville was also the beating heart of its suburb. Families built their lives around the hospital. Warders, cooks, nurses, engineers, and generation after generation found steady work within its walls. Bakers, butchers, and dairymen from the neighbourhood supplied food. And the hospital was not just an institution, it was an economy. Some families' names remain tied to the place. The Fryer family, for example, contributed across 3 generations, carpenters, engineers, and volunteers. In recognition, a street in the redeveloped campus was named Fryer Place, and they weren't the only ones. A close friend of mine has shared a few stories about his own family that had worked at Gladesville for generations, building a life and livelihood around the hospital. It's a reminder that this site wasn't just an institution, it was the backbone of the entire community, shaping the stories of countless local families. When the hospital finally closed in 1998, the land did not fall silent. Today, the grounds house the Gladesville Police Station, St John's Ambulance, and a number of health organisations. The Spasm Museum, open monthly, preserves artefacts and memories from across its 160-year history. Walking the site today, you see street names that keep its history alive. Digby for the first keeper, Campbell for the superintendent, Norton Manning for the great reformer, Mortimer Lewis for the architect, and each name a reminder of the layers of lives lived here. Gladesville's story is not simple. It is not one of pure cruelty nor pure compassion. It begins in chains, convicts dragged here in irons, locked in cells, bled and beaten into silence. It endured scandals of abuse, corruption and misery. But it also birthed reformers like Norton Manning, who dreamed of gardens, cottages and dignity for the insane. It gave work and pride to patients once forgotten. It gave sport and celebration to a community that grew up around it. It hosted Don Bradman on its fields. It sent patients rowing down the Parramatta River. And in its later years, it became a symbol of change as psychiatry moved away from confinement and towards community. Today, its grounds are open. The gates no longer lock, but the stones remember. Gladesville Hospital stands as a monument to the way we once treated and mistreated the most vulnerable amongst us. A place of darkness, a place of light, a place where the shadows of history still linger on the banks of the Parramatta. Are any parts of Gladesville Hospital still in use today, or is it completely closed? From a distance, Gladesville looks abandoned. The sandstone walls weathered, the old ward standing empty. The lawn's eerily quiet, but if you look closer, it's not completely gone. Parts of the grounds are still alive. The police station operates here, the St. John's ambulance trains new recruits, and the Spasm Museum keeps medical artefacts and stories safe. Walking past these modern services while surrounded by 19th century asylums is surreal, like two centuries colliding on the same patch of ground. Gladesville hasn't vanished, it lingers, half living, half ghost, a place that refuses to be forgotten. Can the public actually walk around the old hospital grounds, or are some areas restricted? That's one of the most striking things about Gladesville today. The gardens are open, you can wander the lawns, follow the river paths, or picnic beneath the old trees where patients once worked the gardens. Families walk their dogs here, joggers pass the wards, and it feels strangely normal. But then you notice the locked doors, the sealed windows, the wards frozen in silence. The public is free to roam, but only to a point, and those boundaries carry their own weight. The openness invites you in, while the restrictions remind you that was never just a park, it once was a prison for the mind. Is Gladesville Hospital considered haunted, and have there been ghost stories or paranormal reports from the site? With 160 years of suffering, it's almost impossible for a place like Gladesville not to gather ghost stories. Visitors have spoken of screams from empty wards, footsteps in deserted corridors, and shadows at the edge of the river. Some swear they've seen figures at the windows, others feel the temperature drop as they cross certain lawns. Whether you believe or not, the atmosphere is undeniable. The air feels heavy, and if the walls could themselves are holding on to the memories of the people who once lived here and died here, paranormal or not, the haunting is real. It is haunting of history, of lives confined and forgotten, still pressing against stones long after the gates have opened. Did famous or notable patients ever spend time at the hospital? Most of Gladesville's patients were ordinary people whose names never left the hospital records, but history remembers a few. Louisa Lawson, mother of poet Henry Lawson, spent her final years here struggling with her mental health. And there were whispers of figures whose names carried weight outside those walls. These glimpses remind us that mental illness didn't discriminate the poor, the powerful, the creative, the criminal all ended up behind the same bars, and it forces us to look again. How many stories of influence and talent were silenced at Gladesville before they could never be told?